The nature and obligation of public vows, with an explanation and defense of the British covenants, by the Reverend William Symington, Doctor of Divinity, Glasgow, being number 7 of a course of lectures on the Second Reformation. Glasgow, 1841. Lecture 7. The nature and obligation of public vows, etc. The Reformation in Scotland derives a striking distinctive feature from those federal deeds by which it was carried forward, consolidated, and secured. At every step of its advancement we meet with protestations, confessions, oaths, covenants, vows. It is owing to this circumstance, indeed, that it is commonly spoken of as the Covenanted Reformation. The men by whom it was promoted frequently and formally bound themselves to God and to one another by solemn transactions of the nature in question. On the banners which they unfurled in the field of conflict, and around which they gathered in defense of their dearest liberties and rights, was conspicuously emblazoned the motto, "For Christ's crown and covenant." For adhering to such sacred engagements, our persecuted forefathers were indicted, tried, and condemned, and expressions of attachment to them formed part of their dying testimonies on the scaffold, in consequence to which they have come to be spoken of under the honorable designation of, quote, the martyrs of the covenant, unquote. In an attempt to delineate the facts and principles of the period in which the remarkable deeds in question were framed, it is impossible to overlook the deeds themselves, and so prominent and important is the feature under consideration that we can only lament the limited space afforded for the course of lectures for its exhibition and discussion. Before speaking of the British covenants themselves, however, it will be necessary to go at some length into the nature and obligation of public religious vows for the purpose of exhibiting the principles on which these federal bonds rested, and by referring to which alone can either their formation be vindicated or their authority be substantiated. And this is all the more requisite that the subject has been long treated with unmerited neglect by the great body of professing Christians in these lands. First, the nature of covenants. A covenant is a mutual engagement between two parties in which certain performances are stipulated on the one hand and certain promises on the other. A covenant differs from a law, a vow, and an oath. It differs from a law in this, that it supposes mutual stipulations, while in a law there's no stipulation at all, but simply the authority of a superior enjoining obedience on an inferior. It differs from a vow inasmuch as, while a covenant supposes engagement on both sides, a vow supposes engagement on one side only, the person who vows engaging to perform some particular service without any promise being supposed to be annexed to the performance. It differs also from an oath being nothing more than a solemn appeal to God for the truth of some assertion that is made without, as in a covenant, either an engagement to duty or a promise of reward. In a covenant, then, there is engagement by two parties. In a vow, there is engagement by one party only. In an oath, there is no engagement at all. From all this, it must appear that a covenant, while differing essentially in its own nature from a law, a vow, and an oath, nevertheless at once supposes the existence of a law and includes both an oath and a vow. It proceeds on the supposition of something being obligatory, and here is the idea of law. It implies an engagement to perform what is admitted to possess obligation, and here is the idea of a vow. It supposes the covenanter to appeal to God with regard to the sincerity of his intentions, and here is the idea of an oath. According as one or another of these ideas is designed to be brought distinctly out, the same deed may be spoken of by one or another of these terms, that is to say, it may be spoken of as a covenant or an oath or a vow, the words being used interchangeably to designate the same transaction, although each in itself, when strictly interpreted, exhibits the transaction under one feature only. In a covenant, however, there is involved an idea different from all that have just been specified. It comprehends indeed a law, a vow, and an oath. But these are not all that it comprehends. It differs from them all in this, that a covenant supposes the party with whom it is made to engage on the performance of what is stipulated by the other party, to bestow upon him certain favors. It supposes, that is to say, a promise of reward which is not necessarily involved in any of the others. Such is a covenant. A covenant is either civil or religious. Civil, when entered into between men or societies of men with respect to the affairs of this life. Religious, when entered into between God and men with respect to the duties men owe to God, more especially religious duties. A religious covenant is either personal or social. Personal, when an individual engages on the one hand to keep the commandments of the Lord, and takes hold by faith on the other of God's gracious promises. Social, when a society engages with joint concurrence to perform certain duties and to embrace with one heart the precious promises of Jehovah. It is competent to any society, be it a family, a church, or a nation, to enter with common understanding and consent into a federal transaction, and when this is done by a large corporate body, the transaction is called a public social covenant. It is this that we are now to have under our consideration. In explaining the nature of a public social covenant, we beg to submit the following statements. First, a covenant is a mutual, solemn religious transaction between God and men. The parties in such a transaction as that of which we are speaking are God and men, betwixt whom there is understood to be a mutual engagement. Thus, in reference to what took place at Sinai, it is said, quote, "Now, therefore, if ye will obey my voice and keep my covenants, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded them. And all the people answered and said, All that the Lord hath spoken, we will do." Unquote. That from Exodus 19, verses 6 through 8. Here are manifestly two parties, with their stipulations and re-stipulations. There is on the one hand God as a God of mercy in Jesus Christ, and as King and head of his church, and people Israel, saying, quote, "Ye will obey my voice, and shall be a peculiar treasure unto me." Unquote. And there are, on the other hand, the people of Israel as men professing the name, receiving the institutions, obeying the commandments, and seeking the glory of the Lord their God, saying, quote, "All that the Lord hath spoken we will do." From the covenant being styled in Scripture, quote, "the Lord's covenant," unquote, rather than the people's, some have drawn the inference that it is not to be regarded as a mutual engagement but as a law, not a compact between parties, but simply the will of a superior enjoining obedience on an inferior. That the covenant is styled the Lord's covenant does not, however, prove that there is not a mutual engagement, for, first of all, it is perfectly natural and right that a transaction betwixt unequal parties should receive its designation from the more dignified of the two, and, then again, it is not always the case that this rule is observed, there being at least one instance in which a covenant with God is designated after the human party, quote, "I will for their sakes remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt," unquote. Leviticus 26, verse 45. Not to mention the fact that covenants between men and vows and oaths in which God is properly no party at all are spoken of as his on account of his being a witness to them. We need not wait to prove that such a mutual transaction as is involved in the nature of a covenant with God possesses a character of great solemnity. The majesty of the being with whom it is entered into, the infinitely righteous, holy, and omniscient Jehovah, the nature of the duties engaged to be performed, and the awful judgments attendant on unfaithfulness, must be sufficient to banish everything like levity and carelessness, and to induce a feeling of deep and impressive seriousness. As little does it require to be proved that a covenant possesses a decidedly religious character. It is not only divinely commanded, but a direct act of worship. This is the case even when its matter may not be expressly of a religious nature. When the matter of a covenant is civil or political, it supposes an acknowledgment of God, and not only recognizes his existence, but also involves a formal address or appeal to him as a party. It must therefore be looked upon as an act of religious homage or divine worship, in the same way as an oath taken about a civil matter is regarded by all as a religious act. We further remark that a covenant is a voluntary transaction. We mean not by this that it is optional with us whether we shall enter into such engagements, if, as we hope to be able afterwards to prove, they are of moral obligation, the neglect of them must be positively sinful in the sight of God. Still, it is not on this account less true that to constitute covenant obligations, the voluntary agreement of both parties is essential. This arises out of the very nature of the thing, there being no other conceivable way in which a mutual compact can ever possibly exist. By refusing to enter into such engagements, men may contract guilt, and great guilt too, but it is the guilt of contemptuously disregarding God's authority and slighting God's institution, not the guilt of covenant violation. The guilt of neglect may not be, it may even be more, than that of breach of covenant. But it is not guilt of the same kind, whatever its degree. It differs in its nature from the other. The will of both parties is thus essential to the existence of a covenant. It is easy to see how men act their part in such a transaction. Their voluntariness in the matter becomes sufficiently apparent in their acknowledging the obligation of the duty, in their actually swearing unto the Lord, and in their making diligent efforts to perform. It is more difficult to see how God acts his part. Under the former dispensation, indeed, when immediate revelations of the divine were not uncommon, there was less difficulty than now, when such preternatural communications have ceased. Still, however, when we reflect on the divine being as revealing the duty plainly to men in his word, calling on them in his providence to take active steps in the matter, granting them opportunities, raising up persons to take the lead, putting it onto the hearts of his people to go forward, and withal leading them his gracious countenance, and withal lending them his gracious countenance and blessing, when we reflect on these things, we can be at no loss to perceive how God acts his part, also in a covenant transaction.